I believe in every kid's life there are bizarre things that occur which they can't understand or process. Many of these things are benign to adults with the maturity and wisdom to comprehend them. A door creaking in the middle of the night, it's the wind, or a pet moving it to an adult, but to a child, it's a ghost or a monster coming to get them. Only after adulthood can a child look back and say to themselves, "Wow, I was so naive," and laugh with their siblings saying, "We were so silly when we were young." Or perhaps as the children grow and mature, they think back on certain events, and rather than laugh at their naivety, they whisper to their now adult siblings and say, "You know what? That was a really messed up thing that happened to us when we were young." I was 10 years old and the eldest of 3 children, myself, younger sister Nikki, and youngest brother Luke. It was 2001 and we lived in a small suburban neighborhood just outside of Houston, Texas, with my mother and father. Honestly, our childhood and upbringing in general would be considered the epitome of normal. Dad owned a small plumbing business and Mom was a homemaker. We weren't rich, but we had everything we needed, though we definitely were not spoiled. I got along fine with my brother and sister, aside from the normal whining and occasional arguments and slaps that siblings exchanged growing up. My parents loved each other, I mean truly. They almost never argued, and when they were together they were usually smiling and hugging one another. The one thing Mom and Dad didn't have much time for was leaving the house for an evening out. Honestly, during my childhood I can recall my parents going on a date or socializing maybe a dozen times without us kids, I mean. Later that year, new neighbors moved in a few houses down from us. We heard our parents talking about them and saying it was a very old woman and her daughter, who was perhaps in her early 50s, who lived together in the house. My mother had said the daughter seemed extremely quiet and stoic, but the much older mother seemed very lively and energetic for her age, and was quite talkative and sociable. My mother liked the old woman, whose name was Margaret. Every other day, it seemed like Margaret and her 50-year-old daughter would come by to chat with my mom. My mother always welcomed them in, and she would offer them a drink and commence discussions lasting for hours about every tedious subject you could imagine. Politics, the economy, raising kids, religion, books, movies, I mean anything and everything. The old woman did all the talking, besides my mother, of course, while her daughter remained quiet the entire time. Every time. She was really strange, and us kids didn't like being near her. Every now and then she would look over at us playing, and I can't explain the look she had. It was expressionless, and now thinking back, I believe it was resentful, and maybe even malicious. She looked like someone who hated us, and was quietly imagining awful things she wished she could do to us. Or maybe it was just the feeling we got being young kids around someone very different than ourselves. Either way, it was during one of these frequent visits and long chats that Mother let out a happy squeal. Margaret had suggested she babysit us kids so that my parents could have a much-needed date night. My mother was so excited and happy, and we didn't mind. Margaret seemed perfectly normal. It was her daughter we didn't like. The date was set for next Saturday evening. Margaret was to arrive at 6 p.m. and watch us until my parents returned around 11 p.m. To our great relief, Margaret arrived that Saturday alone. Her daughter, who was a nurse at the local hospital, was on call. My parents exchanged a few pleasantries and instructions with Margaret regarding care for us, and then they said their goodbyes to us kids and left on their date. For the first hour, it was the usual scene, kids playing games with each other and the babysitter on the couch watching television. But then suddenly Margaret turned off the TV and shouted, "Get over here. I'm going to tell you a bedtime story, then you're all off to bed." We whined to her that it was only 7 p.m. and we could stay up late on Saturdays because we don't have school. As we finished, we looked to her waiting for a response, but to our surprise, she said nothing, just stared at us. Instantly, I realized Margaret's face looked identical to her strange daughter's, emotionless and indifferent. She repeated, "Sit down." So we did. She stood up from the couch and walked a few steps over to the old wooden rocking chair that had been in our family for ages. It was our grandmother's, and after she passed, our mother had taken it and had told us of the fond memories she had sitting in the chair on her mother's lap as she rocked her to sleep as a young child. But now there was a creepy old lady sitting in it, rocking back and forth with no expression on her face, staring at us. She did this for several minutes before stopping, leaning towards us, and saying softly, "All right, let's begin." "This is a beautiful old rocking chair," she said as she began to rock again. "It has history, doesn't it? History that's lost on silly children like you. Do you little brats know what the Great Depression was?" We slowly shook our heads no. "Of course you don't. You're little spoiled monsters. Your mommy and daddy want to make you happy and keep you fat. Well, let me tell you what a Great Depression is. It's a time when no one has work, so no one has money. And without work and money, you have no food. And without food, ordinary good people turn into savages. You little pigs don't know the first thing about suffering, about desperation. Do you?" She shouted those last words and startled us. We instinctively shook our heads no in response. "Of course not," she continued. "Well, let me educate you. When a human being is starving and suffering, there is nothing they wouldn't do to survive. Nothing. My father knew this. He was a strong and wise man. When the Depression came, neighbors turned on neighbors. Looting and violence was everywhere. My father knew he had to find a way to save his family, or we would all perish. My father was a descendant of ancient and proud Germanic blood. His ancestors knew dark rites and ancient wisdoms forgotten in modern times. Almost forgotten by him, if it were not for the desperate times calling upon the ancient wisdom in his blood. One day he called my two sisters and I to join him in the old shed he had in our backyard. It was his work shed, you see, and there he had saws and tools and everything he needed to work. He must have been up all night, because there in the shed was 2 wooden rocking chairs, one finished, the other needed only the legs and rocker to be complete. But it was not help carving wood or assembly that Father needed his daughters. He told us we would all perish in these horrible times if we did not invoke the old ways only he knew, but he would teach us. We sat on the cool earth floor of the shed as Father carved and bonded and assembled the final pieces of the last rocking chair, and afterwards he drew a small knife and explained we would each need to draw blood for the rite. We cut our hands and he gathered the blood into a metal cup, the same cup that he used for mixing the lacquer that would coat the chairs. With the blood and lacquer mixed in the cup, he whispered in tongues we could not understand and chanted as he brushed the lacquer onto the bare wood, and with his cut hands he stroked the arms of the chair, leaning in and whispering back and forth. Afterward, he saw to our wounds and to his own and explained that we should not tell our mother, as she would not understand, so we didn't tell her. The next day the lacquer had dried and the rocking chairs were finished. My father told Mother that he had made the chairs to barter for supplies or food, and she was excited and hopeful. My father then told us to go to the neighbors, namely neighbors we knew to be selfish and wicked. My sisters and I lugged one of the heavy chairs down the street to the first neighbor's house, who answered the door with a stern look and a shotgun in hand. We told the man at the door that our father had made the chair for him and his family, and only asked for a dozen eggs or a few pieces of wood in return. The man was overjoyed. He quickly grabbed a dozen eggs from the hen house in his backyard, and after putting them in a ragged box, handed them to us before taking the chair inside without a word and slamming the door behind him. We returned to Father with the eggs, and told him all that transpired. He seemed pleased, and told us to bring the eggs to Mother. The next day we did the same with the second rocking chair. We brought the chair to an old woman who lived with her spiteful son and never helped a soul. Her and her son snatched the chair up into the house, and then the son returned with a few potatoes and a loaf of bread before slamming the door without a word. We returned to Father as before, and as before he seemed pleased and instructed us to bring the potatoes and bread to Mother. A few days passed, and word quickly spread that the man with the shotgun was found dead in his home, sitting in his rocking chair. Those who witnessed the scene described that the man appeared as though he had been dead for years and was severely desiccated, almost appearing mummified. Later that day, the small town was devastated by the discovery of 2 additional citizens deceased in their home. The desiccated bodies of the old woman and her son were found in the same condition as the man with the shotgun. The son was sitting in the chair and the mother was laying on the floor beside him, her hands still clutching at the chair as though the two had been fighting over it. The next day, my mother returned from the mailbox after retrieving the mail and began shouting for my father. My father came to the front door and met my mother, where she showed him a letter that had come in the mail. The letter was from an old friend of my father's, who, despite the depression, was managing a successful and thriving business. In the letter was attached a check for $3,000 and an invitation to move to his state and take up a supervisory position working with him. I will never forget my father's face. As my mother hugged him and us and squealed with relief and joy, my father stared at my sister and I. Not a stare of relief and joy, but a stare of confidence. A stare that we recognized and understood without my father speaking. A stare that spoke, "See, my daughters, see the fruit of our labors, the great reward for remembering the ancient wisdoms." "Now go to bed," Margaret shouted at us after concluding. And so, startled, we got up from the floor and went to bed. And as we did, I looked back at her, rocking in the old wooden rocking chair, stroking the arms of the chair, leaning in and whispering, back and forth, over and over.